do a quick demo of how I use contrast paints to do shading. Kind of a method I use that is what I use mostly on the miniatures for the that you see on the Black Scorpion website. Kind of a quick method. Tend to paint. We have packs of 4 mainly, so because of time restraints, generally have to paint one of those packs in about a day. So looking at a few hours, kind of a style that takes a few hours on the model, so hopefully enough to make it look nice for the website, but obviously you just don't have the time to do a competition level paint job. And so anything that kind of makes things easier or quicker but looks good is nice. So before the contrast paints came out, I'd kind of already developed a style that was using a similar method, but I really like the contrast paints just because they're designed specifically for it and the colours are really good. I know the companies are bringing out their own versions, so I'm sure there's other options out there, but those are the ones I've got at the moment. And so I'm just going to do a quick demonstration on the yellow here, just to show you one way of how I kind of highlight, shade and highlight back up. Yes, all I've got here is I obviously just sprayed this black and I've base coated it yellow. Obviously with something like yellow or lighter colours or a black undercoat, you're going to need to paint a couple of layers, and generally, specifically with yellow, you probably want to start with a different colour first. So something like the Vallejo Stone Grey is a very good colour. It's got very good coverage even when it's thin as a first coat, and then the yellow over it. Obviously just thin your paint and build up the layers until you've got the base coat. That's probably another video about base coats. So just to save time, I've already done that, and I'll show you kind of the method I use for most of the models. So got the contrast medium, which I'm going to use a lot, mixing in with everything. And the base colour, by the way, the main one is kind of these P3 paints, sulphuric yellow with a little bit of this rucksack tan. But obviously you can, whatever yellow or whatever colour you happen to be doing. And these contrast paints, I'll be using these. And so one of the little tricks I do as a first, apologies if my hand keeps coming across the camera, I'll try and one of the little tricks I'll do for the contrast is actually put a little bit of the base colour. Doesn't really matter if you can see what I'm doing here, but I'll take a touch of the base colour just put the contrast onto a palette and then just put a tiny touch of that base colour into the contrast. And then, very important, is I mix at least kind of 50% of the contrast medium into it. I think this is probably where I see a lot of people kind of going wrong with contrast paints, is just using it straight out of the pot, which I know they kind of advertise it as that. I think it's probably too harsh, and I'm certainly not a fan of the kind of over the white. But I'm basically kind of using them as actually as inks. And the contrast medium helps it not be so harsh. You can even go quite extreme, use it as a glaze. But anyway, for now, so I've mixed in probably about half, and then I'm just going to go with the yellow with that. And just by mixing in a tiny touch of the original base colour just helps it kind of not be too dramatic. Depending on, I use this method for pretty much every colour, but depending on what colour, particularly kind of light neutral colours, you might have to play around to get the contrast right and mix it a bit and be very careful with it. Because if you're doing something that's like an off-white, you can't just get a brown and it'll be too harsh. So do little experiments and play with it a bit. And I'm only doing the front of this yellow just as a demonstration. And so what I'll do while that's still wet, so then I'll take a darker contrast or mix something in. In this case, this one happens to work well, so I'll just take this one, touch it into the first shade just ever so slightly. And again, be sure to add quite a bit of the contrast medium. And with this one, I'm not going to go over the whole thing again, but just where the really dark recesses, and this is actually optional if you want to just create a bit more shade. Just where maybe there's some really dark recesses might be, just touching in a darker whilst it's still wet. And if anything you don't like or it pulls too much, you can just touch it up with a brush and yeah, if you do choose to put a second darker contrast in there, just be careful, don't go too over the top with it, and make sure it's subtle. Do a little test somewhere first. Okay, so at that stage we're going to let that dry. It's important to make sure it's completely dry at this stage, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how I kind of add the highlights and apply a glaze, and we'll go from there. Okay, so the contrast is now dry. So all I've done is mixed up some of that original base colour, thinned it down a little bit, and the first highlight we're just going to put back over as the original highlight, just to kind of distinguish where the highlights are going to go and just neaten up a little bit. And obviously if you start putting that on and think it's not looking right, too light or something, just adjust as needed. So just very quickly, just covering the main by keeping your paint very thin, you can, if you need, you just blend it in slightly with the where it needs to with the shadow. So then what we'll do is add in something like this. This is Men Off White base. It's kind of a bleach bone colour. Add a little bit of that in, and maybe just a touch of white. I'm adding it You can see what I just did there is a tiny bit of matte medium, which I don't normally do. I'm only doing that just for recording because the camera picks up the shininess a lot more than it is in reality. Contrast can be shiny on occasion, but I really don't worry about it because I just use a really good matte varnish at the end, so I would never worry too much about shininess because you can always fix that at the end. And so I've just made another highlight colour, make sure it's thinned down. This is obviously a quick demonstration. In reality, I might do some more, depending on time, more subtle layers, but the benefit of the key point basically to this method is using the contrast paint, making sure you've got a lot of at least 50% contrast medium, mixing a tiny bit of the base colour in with it, and where needed just taking your time to, if you need to mix some contrast paints or come up with the right colour, just take your time, as opposed to using a contrast straight out of the pot and just, you know, going straight over a colour which can be too harsh. There are certain colours where that can actually work, but in general it's just too extreme. And so by using the contrast almost as an ink that works really well, just saves time and does the shading very quickly for you, like I showed you earlier with putting in a second darker one when it's still wet. Just very quickly gives you kind of the quick shading. Yeah, so just for demo purposes, this highlight here is probably a little bit lighter than I would actually do at that stage, but I just want to do this just to demonstrate the method. That's what I generally do at this stage. Let's take a bit of the contrast again. Bring that one, I might put just the tiniest touch of the darker one in it. And this time I'm going to use a lot of the contrast. Almost, I don't know, 2/3 to basically making a glaze, but using the contrast and the contrast paints and contrast medium to make a glaze that works really well. And depending on how much contrast medium you add really depends on. In general, go for lots, because if it's, you know, if you make it too weak, so to speak, it doesn't matter, you can always do it more, but too strong, you can always do a little test area and rub it off. But yeah, so just by putting that contrast glaze back over it, kind of brings it all back together very quickly and easily. And so this is pretty much what I'll do for most of the models, obviously to pick the right colours, the right areas and the right contrast. And depending how it goes, I'll add more glazes, more highlights, just adjust as needed. But by getting that initial kind of shade in so quickly, and it just saves so much time. Yeah, so we'll let that dry and I'll come back and show you what it's like when it's dry and where we go from there. Okay, so the that glaze dried, and all I've done since then is I just touched up the just some of the other areas where just to neaten out the belt and everything. I'm not actually going to paint this model, but so I just painted them black just so what I've actually painted stands out neatly. And then yeah, the only other thing I've done is I just put a bit of matte varnish on, which is still drying. Just about dry, I can just see this will be all completely matte. And so yeah, that's just to give you a general gist of how it's done. Obviously from here, if you were painting this, you can then add more highlights, more glazes, or get the original base colour and just neaten up some of the mid areas if you wanted to, depending on how much time you want to spend on it. So that's the general idea of the method I use for the website painting. It's quite a quick and effective method, especially for the shading. And so the key thing to remember is to add lots of contrast medium to any contrast you use, and just a little touch of the base colour, original base colour. And with all my models, I give it a really good coat of matte varnish. Particularly if you're photographing, matte varnish is very important because it just the light and photography will just reflect any shine, which in reality may look fine, but so yeah, I'll obviously be doing some more painting demos, but any questions about that method or anything else, just let me know and I'll, time permitting, try to make a video on it. Hope this helped. Cheers.